The Fairfax County courthouse smelled of polished oak and cold stone, the kind of air that presses down on you with the weight of judgment. My boots clicked in rhythm against the marble floor as I walked toward the front, every step echoing louder than the last. The army dress blues fit sharp and heavy, the Army Commendation Medal and recruiter badge glinting against my chest. To strangers in the room, they were symbols of honor. To my family, sitting across the aisle, they were just proof that I had become the bossy daughter they had always accused me of being. 200 people filled the benches. Community members, councilmen, even old neighbors who once smiled at me during block parties. They all leaned forward as if my life was a stage play they'd paid tickets for. And then, like a crack of thunder, my mother's voice ripped through the chamber. "Hija Mandona, you destroy everything you touch." She stood in her crimson shawl, pointing at me like she wanted the whole county to see what kind of daughter she claimed she had raised. Laughter rippled among some in the gallery, but mostly there were whispers, low, eager, poisonous. My brother Diego didn't stay seated either. He leaned forward, smooth in his navy suit, eyes sharp with the confidence of a man who never doubted he'd be believed. "She bullied kids into quitting. Look what happened to the center. She pushed until it collapsed." Gasps and murmurs spread across the room. A few council members exchanged glances, nodding as if the verdict was already sealed. A woman in the second row shook her head slowly, whispering to her neighbor, "Poor girl. Can you imagine being screamed at like that?" Another muttered, "She thinks she's still in the army." The lawyer for the community board strode to the center of the floor, his polished shoes squeaking faintly. With a practiced click of a remote, the courtroom screen lit up. A grainy video played. Me in uniform leaning forward across a desk at a young recruit. My voice was raised, my finger pointed, my posture commanding. To anyone without context, I looked every bit the caricature they wanted me to be: harsh, unforgiving, dangerous. "This," the lawyer said, turning to the judge, "is how she treats our youth. Military intimidation, abusive style. She is unfit to lead anything in this community." The whispers turned to a low hum. "She's too controlling. Those poor kids. Military mindset gone wrong." Every phrase stung, but none of it was new. I'd been called bossy since I was 8 years old. I'd been told I ruined things since I was 15. I stood straighter, chest rising with the same slow breath I used before facing a room full of recruits whose futures depended on me. I didn't speak, not a single word. Instead, I reached up with steady hands and unclipped the Army Commendation Medal from my uniform. The tiny pin resisted for a second, then gave way. I set the medal carefully on the witness table in front of me. The sound of metal against wood rang out sharp and final. For a moment, the entire courtroom froze. It was thunder in silence. I met my mother's eyes. She looked triumphant, mistaking my silence for surrender. Diego smirked, sure that his polished performance had ended the matter. The lawyer returned to his seat, papers rustling like applause. But I stayed still, chin lifted, uniform crisp, heart steady. Judge Whittaker adjusted his glasses, clearly unsettled. "Staff Sergeant Martinez," he said slowly, "do you wish to respond to these accusations?" I held his gaze, but my lips didn't move. The longer the silence stretched, the more restless the gallery became. Someone coughed, another shifted uncomfortably on the wooden bench. My mother leaned toward Diego, whispering in Spanish loud enough for me to hear, "Mira, she has nothing to say. Empty medals, empty girl." Heat rose in my chest, but I didn't let it show. I'd learned long ago that silence could be sharper than words, more precise than any bullet. My promise wasn't to convince them. My promise was to outlast them. They called me Promise once, I thought, watching the metal glint under the fluorescent lights. Now they call me Destroyer, but a promise kept in silence screams louder than any defense. The gavel struck lightly. "We'll proceed," the judge said, his voice firm but his eyes betraying curiosity. The gallery shifted again. A man in the back row leaned forward, whispering, "Why won't she defend herself?" His wife shrugged, eyes locked on me. Maybe she knows something they don't. The curiosity in their voices mixed with suspicion, and the air thickened, charged like a storm waiting to break. The sound of the gavel echoed, but my mind was already moving backward, past the uniforms, past the metal, past the silent stares, back to a barbecue when I was 8 years old, when the first cracks of this story began. And that is where the truth of it all really started. The memory rose uninvited as the judge's gavel echoed. Long before uniforms, medals, or courtrooms, there was a summer afternoon when the whispers about me first began. I was 8 years old, barefoot in the grass at my family's barbecue, sweat dripping down my back as I organized my cousins into a makeshift football team. The Virginia sun blazed, and the smoky smell of carne asada filled the air. The adults lounged with cold drinks, but I couldn't stand watching chaos. I grabbed a ball, whistled with my fingers, and barked commands like a drill sergeant. "Javier, your quarterback. Marisol, you cover left. No tighter like this," I shouted, pointing sharply. The younger cousins giggled. Some obeyed, others rolled their eyes, but I kept barking orders. To me, it wasn't a game, it was strategy, a mission. That's when my Aunt Rosa shook her head. "Ay, Dios mío, Crystal, my Mandona, you're too bossy." Her voice was loud enough for everyone to hear. My father, Roberto, leaned back in his chair. "Mija," he said with a sigh, "life isn't a boot camp. Let kids be kids." The words stung. My cousins burst into louder laughter, and before I knew it, a chant started. "General Crystal, General Crystal." They marched around me, mocking my sharp hand signals. One cousin saluted with exaggerated formality. Another barked fake orders in a silly voice. I dropped the ball, but I didn't cry. I clenched my fists and looked toward the grill where Abuelo Ernesto stood, tending the flames. He watched quietly until he spoke in a low voice only I could hear. "She has fuego de lighter. Don't crush that fire." His defense was quiet, but it was enough. For a brief moment, I believed him more than the chorus around me. Still, the whispers grew. That night, after the guests had left, I walked past the kitchen. The window was cracked, and I heard my mother speaking to her sister. "Crystal is difficile, not soft like other girls. She's just strong-willed," my aunt replied. "Too strong," my mother insisted. "Maybe military school, discipline her. She needs to learn to follow, not lead." I froze in the hallway, my small hand pressed to the wall. My chest tightened, the words digging deeper than any playground insult. The next morning at breakfast, no one spoke about it. Diego laughed with my parents, cracking jokes about baseball. I ate quietly, staring at cereal that tasted like cardboard. No one asked me about the game or why I cared so much. I began to understand. Leadership in my family was not seen as strength, it was defiance. That summer I stopped asking cousins to play games. I started running laps by myself instead, timing sprints around the block. While other kids rested, I pushed harder. Every bead of sweat felt like proof I could shape myself, even if the world refused to see me. But the nickname lingered. At school, kids repeated what they'd overheard. General Crystal. Teachers smiled politely but warned me to tone it down. My eagerness to organize projects or lead study groups was marked as arrogance, not initiative. At night, I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly. My mind replayed my mother's words, learn to follow, not lead. I promised myself I would never follow blindly. By the time I was 10, Abuelo had started calling me Promise. He never explained fully, but I saw pride in his eyes each time. "Promise, ven acqui," he'd call. "Promise, listen to this story." He was the only one who saw my stubbornness as worth protecting. He would lean down and whisper, "One day they'll see. Fire like yours doesn't die, it forges steel." But the rest of my family only saw the opposite. To them, I was a problem child, a girl who embarrassed them with her shouting, her intensity, her refusal to blend in. Years later, sitting in that courthouse, the echo of my mother's accusation felt like an old wound reopening. I had been branded difficult before I even knew the word, labeled bossy before I understood what leadership meant. And as the judge's gavel faded into silence, I could feel the weight of that barbecue afternoon pressing on me again. Because that was the first time I learned that my voice, my fire, would never be welcome in my own home. The barbecue memory lingered, but it was not the last time my voice was turned into a weapon against me. 7 years later, I stood in front of the Riverside Youth Center, 15 years old, clutching a stack of petitions in my hands. The brick building had always been our safe place after school, basketball games echoing in the gym, the smell of popcorn drifting from the snack bar, laughter bouncing off the old tiled floors. That summer, rumors spread that the center was losing funding. By July, the council posted a sign on the locked glass doors, closed until further notice. I couldn't accept it. 250 kids had nowhere else to go, nowhere safe from the streets. I organized a petition drive, gathering signatures from classmates and neighbors. My voice carried over the crowd outside the shuttered doors. If we lose this place, we lose our future. Stand with me. A handful of kids cheered, but parents frowned, pulling their children away. One man muttered, "She sounds like she's running a boot camp." The weeks that followed blurred into marches and meetings. I spoke at a city council session, trembling but determined. We need this center. These programs keep us alive, keep us moving forward. Some applauded, but more whispered. One councilwoman shook her head. "Miss Martinez's militant approach is alienating families," she said to the chamber. The words spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. Parents stopped signing petitions. Instead, they started murmuring, "She's too intense, too demanding, turning kids into little soldiers." My brother Diego took those whispers home and repeated them like gospel. One evening, he sneered across the dinner table. "You embarrassed us in front of the whole neighborhood. People are laughing at you." My mother folded her napkin neatly, her voice soft but sharp. "Why can't you just be normal, Crystal? Help quietly the way other girls do?" My father sighed heavily, shaking his head. "Your abuelo filled your head with leadership nonsense, always pushing, never satisfied." Only abuelo looked at me differently. He pulled me aside later that night, his hand resting firm on my shoulder. "Promise, sometimes leaders walk alone first. The crowd will not follow until the road is clear. You cannot expect them to see what you see yet." I wanted to believe him, but the following week the center closed for good. The doors were chained, windows covered. I stood there with my petitions, 200 names scrawled in uneven handwriting, and felt the weight of failure press down on me. Kids who had once played basketball with me now scattered to street corners and empty lots. Parents whispered my name like a curse. At school, classmates repeated what they'd heard from adults. General Crystal failed. One boy snickered as I walked by. Teachers offered polite smiles but avoided conversation. Even my best friend drifted away, afraid of being branded part of my militant crew. One Saturday, I sat on the curb outside the locked center, petitions stacked beside me. My throat burned with words I couldn't say. Abuelo joined me, lowering himself slowly to sit by my side. He didn't scold or comfort. He simply looked at the building, eyes heavy with memory. "The world is quick to blame the one who shouts the loudest," he said. "But sometimes that's the only voice that tries." I turned to him, voice breaking. "They say I ruined it, that I scared everyone away." He shook his head. "No, promise, the adults failed. They let money and pride matter more than children. You tried to fight and they mistook fire for destruction." I wanted to argue, but deep down I knew he was right. Still, the shame clung like smoke. From that moment on, the label hardened. In my family's eyes, I wasn't just bossy. I was dangerous, reckless, the girl who destroyed the youth center. The whispers followed me home into the walls of my own room. At night, I lay awake listening to Diego laugh with friends outside, their voices carefree. I clenched my fists, imagining myself running, training, pushing harder than anyone else. If they called me a soldier, then I would become one. Not in play, not in protest, but for real. Years later, as the courthouse lights buzzed above me, I realized the accusation hadn't changed. They still called me the destroyer, still blamed me for the collapse of something I had fought to protect. But the fire inside hadn't gone out. It was only waiting for its next battlefield. And that battlefield would arrive when I turned 18, standing in front of an enlistment office, ready to prove that my voice was never meant to be silenced. The memory of the chained youth center doors stayed with me through the rest of high school. Every time I walked past the shuttered brick building, it felt like a scar I carried in public. I had tried to fight for it and ended up branded as the reckless one, the destroyer. By the time I was 18, the label had grown heavier than any backpack slung over my shoulders. I knew I couldn't stay. If the community and my family saw me as a problem, then I would leave and prove that my fire was never meant to be extinguished. The night before graduation, my mother sat across from me at the kitchen table. Her fingers twisted the edge of a dish towel as if wringing water that wasn't there. "Crystal," she said softly, "nursing school applications are waiting. It's a good life. You can help people quietly, make us proud." I kept my eyes on her hands, the way they trembled though her voice did not. "I don't want quiet, Mama. I want purpose. I've already filled out enlistment papers. Tomorrow, after the ceremony, I'm going to the recruiting office." Her eyes widened, then filled with tears that she tried to blink away. "Por qué the military? Why must you always choose the hardest road?" Before I could answer, Diego strolled in from the porch, smirking. "Of course she wants the army. She's always wanted to boss people around. Now she'll get paid for it." I didn't rise to the bait. I just stood, folded my acceptance papers, and slipped them into my backpack. The next morning, the auditorium echoed with applause as names were called. When mine rang out, I walked the stage with steady steps, diploma clutched in hand. The whispers followed me even there. "She's the girl who ruined the youth center." I heard it under the cheers. But I also knew something they didn't. I was leaving, and my story was only beginning. Within a week, I stood on the cracked pavement outside the Army recruiting station. The flag snapped in the summer wind, the sound sharp and commanding. I pulled open the glass door and stepped inside. The sergeant behind the desk looked up, eyes narrowing with the kind of assessment only soldiers give. "Name?" "Crystal Martinez," I said firmly. "I want to enlist." Training at Fort Jackson was fire and steel. From the first pre-dawn run, my voice carried louder than the others. When drill sergeants barked orders, I didn't flinch. When recruits stumbled, I pulled them up. My classmates muttered that I was intense, relentless, too much. But this time, too much was exactly what the Army needed. During one brutal exercise, our squad faltered, straggling behind. The drill sergeant glared. "This squad is done unless someone takes control." I stepped forward, lungs burning, voice cutting through the chaos. "On me, left flank move." And for the first time in my life, people followed. We finished first that day. Later that evening, as the sun dropped behind the barracks, the drill sergeant approached me. "Martinez," he said, his voice flat but his eyes glinting. "You've got command presence. Don't waste it." Those words sank deep, pushing out the echoes of bossy and difficult that had haunted me since childhood. For once, my fire wasn't seen as defiance. It was strength. After completing basic, I was recommended for recruiter school. The instructors explained psychological profiles, motivation tactics, the art of persuasion. Where others saw numbers, I saw lives. Every young man and woman who walked into my office wasn't a quota, they were a mission. When I called home to share the news, my mother's sigh was heavy through the line. "So now you talk people into joining the army. That is not a real career, Crystal. It's just more bossiness." Diego chuckled in the background. "Next, she'll be recruiting the mailman." I hung up the phone before they could hear the catch in my breath. Their scorn didn't surprise me, but it still cut deep. Yet each day in uniform proved something different. I wasn't ruining lives. I was shaping futures. The army didn't call me Bossy. They called me Staff Sergeant. The same voice that once drew laughter now drew respect. And though my family dismissed every achievement, I could feel destiny gathering around me. Because I wasn't just enlisting, I was finally finding the place where my fire belonged. What I didn't know was that purpose came at a cost. That lesson would come on my first deployment overseas, where a single death would carve a promise into my soul that I could never break. The transition from recruit to recruiter was quick, almost too quick, but it felt right. I had finally found a place where my intensity was not a flaw, but a weapon sharpened for purpose. Yet it wasn't until Afghanistan that I understood what that purpose really meant. The desert air clung to my skin like sandpaper. Convoys rumbled across the open roads, engines growling, the weight of armor pressing down on everyone inside. I was attached to a unit overseas to observe the young soldiers I had helped bring into the army. Watching them march, sweat soaking their uniforms, I felt a knot of pride and fear. These weren't just names on enlistment papers. They were kids who had walked into my office with doubts in their eyes. I had promised each one of them that they would be ready. Then came the ambush. A late afternoon sun burned against the horizon when gunfire erupted from the ridgeline. Bullets cracked the air, throwing dust into spirals. Soldiers dove for cover. I remember shouting, grabbing the radio, calling in coordinates. But amid the chaos, I saw him, Private First Class Jason Rivera, 19 years old, crouched low but moving the wrong way. His panic betrayed him, eyes wide, breathing ragged. The explosion came from the roadside. Shrapnel tore the ground around us. When the smoke cleared, Jason lay in the dirt, blood soaking through his uniform. I scrambled toward him, dragging him to cover, pressing my hands against his chest. His lips moved, but no sound came out at first. Then, in a whisper I will never forget, he said, "I wasn't ready." I pressed harder, trying to stop the bleeding. "Stay with me, Jason, you're going to be fine." But deep down I knew the truth. He slipped away before the medevac could arrive, the light gone from his eyes. That night, sitting under a desert sky littered with stars, I clenched my fists until my nails cut into my palms. His words echoed in my skull. I wasn't ready. He had been one of mine, a recruit I had sworn to prepare. I had let him walk into war unprepared, and he paid the price. I made a promise then, carved deeper than any oath I had spoken before. I would never send another unready soldier into battle. If they walked through my door, I would break them down and rebuild them. I would demand everything because I knew the cost of asking too little. When I returned to Virginia, the recruiting office felt different. Every file, every handshake, every parent's anxious glance carried the weight of Jason Rivera's last words. I pushed harder than anyone expected. If a recruit couldn't do 10 push-ups, I demanded 20. If their grades sagged, I sat with them until the math made sense. They called me harsh. They called me relentless. But they stayed. They succeeded. Within 3 years, I had recruited more than 500 soldiers, with one of the highest retention rates in the region. Command took notice. At an award ceremony, a colonel pinned the Army Commendation Medal on my chest and smiled. "Staff Sergeant Martinez," he said, "you're the kind of recruiter this army was built on. You don't make promises you can't keep." The nickname followed me out of the ceremony and into every conversation. Promise. It was said with respect, with admiration. My recruits whispered it to new arrivals. Parents repeated it when they thanked me. For the first time, my fire had a name that wasn't an insult. Still, at home, nothing changed. When I called to tell my family about the award, my mother's sigh traveled heavy through the line. "So now you win medals for talking people into things." Diego laughed in the background. "Even the army gives trophies for bossiness." I hung up, the familiar sting returning. Their voices were chains I had carried for too long. Yet when I looked around my office, lined with photographs of recruits who had made it through basic, I knew whose voices mattered. Jason's last words fueled every decision I made. I couldn't save him, but I could save the ones who came after. Each time I shook a recruit's hand and looked into their eyes, I made the same vow: "You will be ready. I promise." That vow became the center of my life, the mission that kept me moving even as the cost grew higher. Because promises in war are not words, they are lifelines. And one broken promise was already too many. But keeping that promise came with sacrifice, one I never saw coming. The closer I grew to my mission, the further I drifted from the people I thought I loved. And soon, a ring on my finger would test whether duty could coexist with family, or if love itself would become the next casualty. Promises can shape a life, but they can also carve out emptiness where love is supposed to live. By the time I was 27, I had built a reputation across Virginia as the recruiter who never gave up on anyone. My office walls were lined with photographs of new soldiers and handwritten notes from parents thanking me for saving their children. Yet behind the photographs and medals, my personal life was crumbling under the weight of duty. Mark entered my life during one of those rare evenings when I let myself breathe outside of the uniform. He was steady, dependable, a logistics officer who understood the tempo of Army life. For a while, he made me believe that maybe I could have both, a mission and a marriage. He slipped a ring on my finger under the dim lights of a small Italian restaurant, his voice low but certain. "Crystal, you've spent your life taking care of everyone else. Let me take care of you." I wanted to believe him. I said yes. For a few months, we tried to build something resembling a future together. But while he planned color palettes for a wedding, I stayed late at the station, working with recruits who were on the edge of quitting. When he called, asking when I'd be home, I answered, "I can't leave yet, one more meeting." It was never just one more. It was always another. The arguments began quietly, then grew sharper. One evening, Mark stood in the doorway of my office, his face tight with frustration. "Crystal, I'm tired of competing with strangers. You spend more time with these kids than with me." "They're not strangers," I replied, the weariness in my voice sharper than I intended. "They are my responsibility." His jaw clenched. "What about your responsibility to me, to us?" I looked at the ring on my finger, heavy as a shackle. "I can't abandon them, Mark," I promised. The ultimatum came soon after. One late night, he sat across from me at the kitchen table, a glass of untouched water between us. "Choose me," he said. "Or choose this job. You can't have both." Silence filled the room. The clock ticked somewhere in the distance, each second stretching like a blade across my chest. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that I could balance both. But deep down, I knew the truth. I wasn't capable of splitting myself in half. My mission had already claimed too much of me. I slid the ring off my finger and placed it on the table. "I can't quit on them," I whispered. His eyes hardened. He stood, the chair scraping against the floor. "Your family was right," he said coldly. "You care more about recruits than the people who actually love you." The words cut deeper than any insult I had faced in courtrooms or training fields. I watched him walk out the door, his footsteps fading into the night. The silence that followed was heavier than combat fire. When my family heard the news, they treated it like vindication. My mother shook her head with a bitter smile. "See, even your fiancé couldn't handle your controlling ways." Diego smirked across the table, his voice thick with triumph. "Guess bossiness isn't good for marriage either." My father muttered quietly, We raised you to build a family, not to destroy one. Their words stung, but not as much as their satisfaction. They saw my heartbreak not as tragedy, but as proof that they had been right about me all along. That night, I sat alone in my office, surrounded by photographs of soldiers who had once been lost kids. Letters from parents covered my desk, each one a reminder of lives changed. My fingers traced over Jason Rivera's name on a memorial plaque I kept close, and the promise I had made beside his dying body came rushing back. I chose 500 kids over one man, I whispered into the empty room. My family calls that proof I'm broken, but maybe it's proof I'm exactly who I need to be. The ring was gone, but the mission remained. And soon, that mission would lead me back to the one person who had always believed in me, my grandfather. His final battle was approaching, and it would test not only my strength, but the very core of the promise I had built my life upon. The end of my engagement left a hollow silence in my life, but it didn't last long. Within months, another call shattered whatever piece I had pieced together. My grandfather, Ernesto, had been hospitalized. The man who once stood at a grill and whispered strength into me now lay in a sterile room surrounded by machines. I drove to the hospital in my uniform, heart pounding harder than it had in any combat zone. When I entered his room, the smell of antiseptic and the steady beeping of monitors wrapped around me. Abulow's frame looked smaller, swallowed by white sheets. But when his eyes opened and found mine, the fire I remembered still flickered. "Promise," he rasped, the nickname a lifeline across decades. I pulled a chair to his bedside and took his hand. "I'm here, Abulo, I won't leave you." The family was absent. My mother said she was too busy to sit for long. Diego stopped by only to sign papers and then left for business meetings. My father sat silently at the edge of the room, always checking his watch. They all excused their absence by saying, "Crystal's used to giving orders and taking them. She knows how to handle this." So it was me who tracked the vitals, who argued with nurses for better care, who learned the schedule of medications. I slept in the hard chair by the window, waking whenever Abulo stirred. One night, his breathing grew shallow and his fingers twitched weakly. Panic rushed through me, but training took over. I adjusted his oxygen, pressed the call button, and began chest support until the staff rushed in. He lived through that night, and when his eyes fluttered open the next morning, he smiled faintly. "You saved me, Nina, just like always." During lucid moments, he clung to clarity. One evening, as dusk painted the hospital room gold, he whispered, "Promise the center, remember the promise." His voice cracked, but I understood. The Riverside Youth Center had been more than a building to him. It had been his dream, his investment, his fight. A few days later, he revealed more. His voice was weak, but his words struck with force. "I'm leaving you the youth center," he said, gripping my hand with surprising strength. "For 30 years, I kept it alive. When the council cut funding, it wasn't budget, it was sabotage. I covered what I could, but they wanted it gone. Now they'll fight you, but this battle is yours." I blinked back tears. "Abulo, why me? Why not Mama or Diego?" His eyes hardened. "Because they care about image, not people. You care about the kids, you always have. Fire like yours chooses its own battles." He pressed an envelope into my hand, sealed and heavy. Inside are documents, proof of what they did, proof of what I saved. But promise, some battles break the heart before they build the victory. The next morning, his condition worsened. Machines hummed louder, nurses moving with urgent precision. I held his hand through the night, whispering prayers, clinging to the rough warmth of his skin. Just before dawn, he stirred once more, his eyes locking on mine. He squeezed my hand faintly, a final burst of strength. Then his grip loosened, and the fire I had leaned on since childhood slipped quietly away. I sat there long after the monitors fell silent, unwilling to release his hand. Tears came, but they weren't just grief. They were fuel. He had trusted me with his last mission. When the funeral came, the church was full. Family members wore black, dabbing their eyes for appearances. My mother sighed loudly, telling anyone who would listen that she had been carrying the burden of his illness. Diego gave a polished speech about legacy, business, and future development. I sat in silence, the envelope heavy in my purse, the truth burning against my side. At the reading of his will, the air in the lawyer's office thickened. My mother's pearls gleamed. Diego's cufflinks flashed as he adjusted his tie. When the lawyer announced that the youth center and its endowment were left entirely to me, chaos erupted. "This is absurd," Maria snapped. "She'll turn it into a boot camp," Diego shouted. "She's unfit," my father muttered. I sat still, remembering the weight of Abulow's hand in mine, the way he had whispered that some battles choose their warrior. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like the outcast. I felt like the chosen. The fight was only beginning, and I knew my family would stop at nothing to strip me of the inheritance. But the sealed envelope still rested in my purse, carrying the evidence and the fire of Abulow's last mission. What none of them realized was that the war for the youth center would reveal more than just family greed. It would expose betrayal, corruption, and a conspiracy that had been festering for decades. And I was ready to fight it. The storm that began in the lawyer's office did not end there. It followed me into the streets, into the whispered phone calls and the glares at the grocery store. By the end of the week, the community council had filed a formal challenge against the will. They claimed I was unfit to manage the youth center and its funds. The words on the paper cut deeper than any battlefield wound. Authoritarian, emotionally unstable, harmful to children. I had spent years saving lives, and now they wanted to paint me as a danger. The first hearing was crowded. My mother sat at the front, pearls gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Diego smirked beside her, his suit tailored sharp, his lawyer whispering strategy into his ear. They looked like a portrait of respectability, while I sat alone at my table in uniform, the envelope from Abulo burning against my side like a secret I wasn't ready to reveal. The opposing lawyer, Sterling Chase, stood with deliberate calm. His voice carried across the chamber. "Your Honor, my clients seek only to protect the children. Miss Martinez's methods are well documented, aggressive, intimidating, harmful. We have video evidence." The lights dimmed and the screen flickered to life. Edited clips played, me shouting at recruits, pounding a fist on the table, pointing a finger at a trembling teenager. Gasps spread through the room. A woman whispered, "She terrifies them." Another shook her head, muttering, "This is abuse, not leadership." I gripped the edge of the table until my knuckles whitened. They had taken moments of discipline, stripped of context, and twisted them into proof of cruelty. I knew those faces on the screen. I knew their stories, kids who had survived gangs, drugs, broken homes. The screams in those clips had been my attempts to break through walls of fear and apathy. What the jury saw was a monster. What I remembered were victories. Diego leaned back, satisfied. "Told you," he muttered to Maria, loud enough for me to hear. "She'll lose everything." But the deeper I looked into Sterling Chase's smirk, the more I understood. This wasn't about fitness or children. This was about land. Late one evening, I combed through public records in my office. Construction permits, zoning requests, campaign contributions. They told a story my family never intended for me to see. Diego's company had filed proposals for luxury condos on the very plot where the youth center stood. And the lawyer representing him, the same firm that had managed the original closure in 2008. The sabotage Abulo had whispered about wasn't just a suspicion, it was fact. My family had orchestrated the downfall of the center years ago, and now they were moving to bury it once and for all. When I confronted my mother outside the courthouse steps, the sun setting behind us, she didn't deny it. "You never understood, Crystal," she said, her voice cold. "That building is wasted space. We need progress, not playrooms for lost children." I stared at her, searching for any trace of the woman who had once held me as a child. All I saw was ambition draped in pearls. "You sabotaged a sanctuary," I whispered, "and you blamed me to cover it." Her lips curled. "And you'll lose again, because people will always believe the worst about you." The next hearing promised more attacks. More parents were lined up to testify, claiming I had scared their children into quitting programs. Each statement felt like a nail sealing a coffin, yet I refused to bow. I carried a Bulow's envelope with me, knowing its contents could change everything, but the time wasn't right. Not yet. On the night before the second hearing, I sat in my empty office, staring at the rows of photographs on the wall. Faces of soldiers I had recruited stared back at me, their eyes filled with pride and purpose. They were proof that the edited videos were lies. But would anyone believe me without them standing beside me? I whispered into the silence, "I need you." And as if the words carried across invisible lines, they began to answer. Texts and emails arrived through the night. "We heard what's happening. We'll be there. Promise you're not alone." The next morning, as I walked into the courthouse, I saw them waiting. Dozens of men and women in uniform and civilian clothes. My recruits grown into soldiers, professionals, leaders. They filled the steps, their presence undeniable. For the first time since the fight began, I felt the weight on my shoulders lighten. The battle was far from over, but I was no longer standing alone. And when the testimony began again, the truth would not be whispered. It would march through those doors in boots and in voices louder than lies. The sight of them on the courthouse steps the next morning hit me harder than any ambush I had faced in uniform. My recruits, my soldiers, stood in a line that stretched down the block. Some wore crisp army dress uniforms, medals pinned proudly to their chests. Others wore civilian suits, their shoulders squared, eyes unshaken. A few carried photographs of their younger selves, reminders of the day they first walked into my office uncertain and afraid. Now they stood as living testimony against the lies that painted me as a destroyer. When I entered the courtroom, the gallery buzzed with confusion. Sterling Chase glanced at Diego, whispering sharply, the confidence draining from his polished smirk. The judge raised an eyebrow as rows of uniformed men and women filed in, their boots clicking against the tile. The sound filled the chamber with authority that no edited video could erase. The first witness called was Sergeant Maria Gonzalez. She walked to the stand with the posture of a soldier who had once been a street kid. Her voice rang clear. "If Staff Sergeant Martinez hadn't recruited me, I'd be dead. She didn't scare me, she saved me. She taught me to run toward responsibility, not away from it." Gasps filled the gallery. Maria's words cut through the narrative Sterling Chase had spun. He tried to object, claiming it was irrelevant, but the judge waved him down. "Overruled. Continue." Next came Captain James Park, a decorated officer with combat ribbons across his chest. He saluted before speaking. Her so-called harsh methods prepared me for war. I survived an IED blast because I had learned discipline under her. She didn't intimidate me. She gave me control when chaos tried to take it. Parents in the gallery leaned forward, whispering now in tones of surprise. Some who had once murmured, abuse now muttered. Maybe she was right. Then Dr. Ashley Thompson took the stand, her white coat a stark contrast to the uniforms. She smiled faintly at me before speaking. "When I enlisted, I was a dropout with no direction. Staff Sergeant Martinez pushed me until I believed in myself. I used her discipline to finish medical school. I saved lives because she refused to let me quit on mine." Each testimony was a strike against the lies. Sterling Chase shuffled papers nervously, his arguments unraveling. Finally, Tech Sergeant Alex Rivera stepped forward. He held up a framed photo of himself at 17, slouched and angry, the image of a kid on the edge of losing everything. Then he held up a second photo, him in uniform, smiling, confident. She didn't recruit me. She rescued me. She looked me in the eyes and said, "You're better than this." That was the first time anyone believed it, and she was right. Silence fell heavy over the room. Even the judge leaned back, folding his hands thoughtfully. But the recruits didn't stop with words. They presented records, retention rates, promotion statistics, letters from parents thanking me for keeping their children off the streets and in classrooms. Charts showed how 95% of my recruits completed training, how 89% advanced in their careers, numbers the opposition could not twist. I looked across the aisle at my mother. Her pearls seemed to weigh heavier on her neck, her eyes darting nervously. Diego clenched his jaw, whispering furiously to his lawyer. The portrait of a confident family was cracking in public. One of the recruits turned to face the gallery. 500 of us stand here today because she refused to let us fail. Call her bossy, call her harsh, but don't call her unfit. Because we're living proof that her fire builds, not destroys. The courtroom erupted, not with chaos, but with applause. Even the bailiff didn't silence it right away. The sound rolled like thunder through the chamber, breaking down the narrative Sterling Chase had built piece by piece. When order was restored, the judge leaned forward. The court has heard sufficient evidence of the positive impact of Staff Sergeant Martinez. The question is no longer about whether she is fit, but about why her family has chosen to paint her otherwise. I sat still, heart pounding, but inside I knew the tide had turned. For the first time in years, I wasn't standing alone against accusations. My soldiers stood with me, their voices drowning out decades of whispers. But I also knew this wasn't the final blow. The envelope a bureau had given me still remained unopened in my purse, waiting for the right moment. My recruits had given me strength, but his letter would give me the truth. And soon, that truth would tear down everything my family had built on lies. The recruits' testimonies had shifted the tide, but I knew the decisive blow still waited inside my purse. The sealed envelope a bureau had pressed into my hand in his final days was heavy with more than paper. It carried decades of silence, of battles he had fought in secret, so that I might be armed with truth when my moment came. The judge called a recess before the next round of arguments. I stepped into the hallway, the envelope clenched tightly. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of responsibility. Abulo's voice echoed in my mind. Some battles break the heart before they build the victory. When court resumed, I rose slowly. "Your Honor," I said, my voice steady. "My grandfather left a letter to be read in this court. It contains evidence directly related to the youth center and this family dispute." Sterling Chase leapt to his feet. "Objection! This is manipulation." The judge raised a hand. "Objection overruled. Proceed." The clerk slit the envelope open, drawing out pages yellowed at the edges. His voice carried through the hushed chamber as he began to read. "My name is Ernesto Martinez. For 3 decades, I invested in the Riverside Youth Center. I funded programs when politicians cut budgets. I paid for repairs when the city claimed there was no money. In 2008, when the center closed, it was not because of lack of funds. It was because of corruption. I have attached documents, bank records, emails, and receipts of bribes paid to council members by my son Diego's company. They wanted the land for development, and they destroyed a sanctuary to get it." A gasp swept the room. Diego's face drained of color. Maria shifted uncomfortably, clutching her pearls so tightly I thought they might snap. The clerk continued. "I did not reveal this earlier because I knew the truth would be dismissed if it came from me. But I leave it now to my granddaughter, Crystal. She carries the fire of leadership that this family never understood. She has been called bossy, difficult, dangerous. But I know her heart. She is promise, and promise keeps what she says. If you are hearing this now, know that the center is in her hands because it was always meant to be, and because I trust her with the legacy of every child who ever walked through its doors. The judge leaned forward, studying the attached documents. Numbers, signatures, counsel emails, all aligned with dates of the closure. It was irrefutable. Sterling Chase scrambled, his voice cracking. "This doesn't prove intent. This could be fabricated." The judge cut him off. "These are certified copies filed with state offices. Mr. Chase, you will restrain yourself." The gallery buzzed louder than ever. Old neighbors whispered. She was right all along. A councilman in the back hung his head in shame. I sat quietly, my heart pounding. A bureau had carried the truth for years, waiting for this very moment. The burden I had borne since I was 15, the guilt of the youth center's collapse, was lifted in a single breath. It had never been my fault. The adults had failed, not me. My eyes blurred with tears, but I held them back. I would not weep in front of Diego. Instead, I turned slightly and looked at the rows of recruits behind me. They nodded in silent solidarity, their presence proof of what a bureau had believed. For the first time, Diego spoke, his voice sharp with desperation. "This is a trick. She manipulated him in his old age. He was confused. The judge slammed the gavel. "Enough. The evidence is clear. This conspiracy to sabotage the youth center for financial gain is now part of the record. Further investigation will follow." Diego sank into his chair, sweat dripping down his temple. Maria turned her face away, but not before I saw the panic in her eyes. As the courtroom settled, the judge addressed me directly. "Staff Sergeant Martinez, the truth has spoken louder than any testimony. The court will review these findings, but know this: you carry not only your grandfather's trust, but this community's hope." I nodded, the words pressing deep into my soul. The fire that had been dimmed by years of blame flared again. I was not the destroyer. I was the heir of a promise sealed in both love and sacrifice. Yet I also knew the fight wasn't over. The truth was out, but the verdict still rested ahead. And the final battle would demand not only evidence, but my voice. For the first time, I would have to speak, not as a recruiter, not as a granddaughter, but as the woman forged by every wound and every promise. And when I rose to testify, I would deliver my fire with precision. Because the next part of this war was mine alone. The courtroom was still vibrating from the thunder of a bureau's words when the judge called for my testimony. For years I had been silent, letting others twist my story into something unrecognizable. But silence had served its purpose. Now the fire he had passed to me demanded a voice. I rose slowly, adjusting the jacket of my uniform. The Army Commendation Medal no longer weighed like a burden. It glinted as if reflecting the letter just read aloud. Every eye in the chamber followed me as I took the stand. I placed my hand on the Bible, swore my oath, and sat with my back straight. My heart pounded like a drum, but my voice was steady when I began. "Your Honor, I didn't recruit 500 soldiers. I saved 500 lives." Sterling Chase immediately objected. "Grandstanding, this is irrelevant." The judge silenced him with a glare. "Let her speak." I turned to the jury. "They call me Bossy. They say I intimidate, that I break people down. They're right, I break them down, but I rebuild them stronger because war doesn't care if you're fragile. Bullets don't care about feelings. The only thing that matters is whether you're ready, and I made sure they were ready." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Sterling tried to rattle me. "Miss Martinez, are you admitting to being abusive in your methods?" I looked directly at him. "I'm admitting to caring more than anyone else, caring enough to be relentless when others would give up. Ask my soldiers if they'd trade my so-called harshness for the graves they might be in now." The judge gestured for me to continue. I reached into a folder and signaled to the bailiff. He connected a laptop to the screen. "Play the recordings." Video filled the courtroom, not the chopped clips Chase had presented, but full-length sessions from my office. In one, I raised my voice at a trembling 17-year-old, but instead of ending there, the video showed what followed. Me sliding a chair closer, talking him through his fear, staying late until he completed his paperwork. In another, I demanded a girl redo her push-ups until her arms shook. Then I knelt beside her, counting every rep, whispering, "I believe in you." She smiled through tears when she finally succeeded. The gallery shifted. Parents who had once glared at me now wiped at their eyes. The judge leaned forward, his hand covering his mouth as he watched. I turned back to the jury. "This is who I am, not a destroyer, a builder." Every recruit who walked through my door became more than what they thought possible. Then came the moment that shook even me. On the screen appeared a live video feed from overseas. Soldiers in dusty uniforms standing on foreign soil saluted. Captain Park's voice rang clear through the speakers. "Your Honor, I'm alive because of Staff Sergeant Martinez. She prepared me when no one else would. If she's on trial, then we all should be." The courtroom erupted, the bailiff barely keeping order. Sterling's face flushed, his papers rattling as he scrambled for a counterargument. But the tide had shifted beyond him. I leaned forward, voice lower now, aimed not at the lawyer but at my family. "I've been called bossy, controlling, too much, and maybe I am. But when Private Rivera was bleeding out in Kandahar, when Sergeant Kim needed someone to believe in him, when 47 kids earned college scholarships because I refused to let them quit, my too much became their just enough." Silence followed, the kind that carries more weight than applause. Even my mother couldn't meet my eyes. Diego sat rigid, his hands clenched into fists on the table. The polished confidence had drained from him, replaced with a tight desperation. The judge finally broke the silence. "The testimony is noted. The evidence stands. This court recognizes not only the validity of Staff Sergeant Martinez's leadership, but the destructive motives behind those who challenged it." I exhaled, my chest trembling. For the first time in decades, the truth was no longer buried. The fire that had been mocked, suppressed, and twisted had burned through the lies. But the battle wasn't finished. The verdict still awaited, and with it the fate of the youth center. I stepped down from the stand, the recruits rising in quiet salute as I passed. Their respect steadied me, reminding me why I had fought this long. The judge announced that final deliberations would begin the next morning. As I left the courthouse, the evening air hit my face cool and sharp. The recruits walked with me down the steps, boots and shoes alike striking in rhythm. The promise I had carried alone was no longer mine to bear. It belonged to all of us now. And as dawn approached, I knew the final chapter of this battle, the verdict, and the legacy it would create, was waiting in the next day's light. The next morning arrived heavy with expectation. The courthouse steps that had echoed with boots and defiance now felt like the stage of an ending and a beginning. Inside, the jury filed back into their seats. I sat straight, my uniform crisp, the medal on my chest no longer a weight but a banner. My recruits filled the gallery, their presence like a wall of strength. Even as my family shifted uncomfortably across the aisle, I felt no anger toward them anymore, only clarity. The judge entered, his gavel striking once. "This court finds in favor of Staff Sergeant Crystal Martinez. The Riverside Youth Center and its endowment shall remain under her stewardship. Furthermore, this court refers evidence of corruption to state authorities for further investigation." The words rang like a bell in my chest. I exhaled slowly, not in triumph but in relief. The truth had finally spoken louder than the lies. My mother covered her face with trembling hands. Diego stood in silence, his polished image fractured, whispers spreading through the gallery about investigations to come. But I didn't look their way for long. Instead, I turned to my recruits. Many of them rose instinctively, standing at attention. Others wiped away tears. Their voices didn't need to say anything. Their presence alone was enough. The promise I had carried was no longer mine alone. Weeks passed, then months. The youth center reopened under a new name, the Promise Legacy Center. Its halls buzzed with life again, basketballs thumping on the gym floor, laughter spilling from classrooms, the hum of computers in labs where teenagers learned skills that could carry them far beyond our city. Where once there had been chains and silence, now there was light. The facility had grown. With a Bulo's fund released, we expanded into a 50,000 square foot space with classrooms, athletic facilities, and mentorship programs. Former recruits returned, not as students but as mentors. Captain Park taught leadership courses. Dr. Thompson hosted medical career workshops. Sergeant Gonzalez coached basketball teams using drills that once saved her life. The circle was complete, those I had once saved now saving others. The results came quickly. Graduation rates in the community soared from 34% to nearly 90%. College acceptance letters arrived in stacks. Parents who had once doubted me stopped me on the street, gratitude softening the suspicion in their eyes. "Thank you for bringing this place back," one mother whispered. "My son has a future because of you." My family tried in small ways to return. My mother called once, her voice hesitant. "Crystal, maybe we were too hard on you." Diego, now facing federal charges, sent no words, only silence. I did not close the door to forgiveness, but I no longer needed their approval. Family, I had learned, is chosen, and mine stood shoulder to shoulder with me inside the center's halls. 1 year after the verdict, a ceremony was held in the courtyard. A new oak tree stood tall, planted in the soil where children once marched with protest signs. A bronze plaque rested at its base, in memory of Ernesto Martinez, who taught us that promises kept in silence speak loudest of all. I placed my hand on the rough bark, feeling both his absence and his presence. "We did it, Abulo," I whispered. "Your fire still burns." As the crowd applauded, reporters snapped photographs, and children played nearby, I felt something I had chased my whole life, a peace not built on silence, but on fulfillment. Leadership was never about control, never about proving others wrong. It was about being there when no one else would, about carrying promises through fire until they became light. Standing before the community, I spoke plainly. I was called bossy, controlling, too much, but leadership isn't about being liked, it's about being needed when it matters most. And I promise you this, as long as I draw breath, this center will stand for every child who believes they are too little, too lost, or too late. Here, they will be enough. The applause rolled through the courtyard like thunder, but it was not for me alone. It was for the legacy, the lives saved, and the fire carried forward. As I look back on this journey, I feel gratitude more than anything else. Gratitude for the soldiers who stood with me, for the children who gave me purpose, and for the grandfather who believed when no one else did. And gratitude for you, listening to this story and carrying its weight with me. I wish you peace and strength in your own battles. If my story has touched you, I invite you to stay with me for more. Subscribe to this channel, share it with those who may need hope, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Every word you share becomes part of this larger promise, that no one fights alone, and no one's fire should ever be extinguished. May you walk with courage, may your promises guide you, and may you always find the strength to turn silence into victory.